Could the Wild swing a draft day trade? Who could potentially be moved and what could we get for them? All that and more on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild. Your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. If this is your first time tuning into Locked on Wild, we're glad to have you along and hope that you stick with us through the rest of the offseason into next year as well. If you are one of the everydayers that tunes in each and every day of the week, we are glad to have you back. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we take a look at the state of potential trades for the Minnesota Wild on the market ahead of the NHL Draft tonight. We'll look at who could potentially be on the block as well as what could potentially be had for them in return. Happy draft day to those who celebrate as the Minnesota Wild get set to pick, at least right now, at the 21st overall pick in the first round. We have taken a look quite a bit at some of the potential options for the Wild in the first round. But now we're going to take a look at what could potentially happen if the Wild decide that they want to acquire some additional picks. And two names that have really garnered some steam in the trade market, the first being Brandon Duhaime. So let's talk about why we've gotten to this point. Well, up till now, there has not been any resolution on a potential contract extension for Duhaime, and it has been reported that Duhaime's agent is playing a little bit of hardball with the Minnesota Wild. And what do we know about Bill Guerin and his thoughts on agents that decide to play hardball? Not a fan. And so while the hope is 100% that Duhaime does re-up, if the Wild find that his demands are a little too pricey, it makes sense to move him to somebody else and get something in return. It has been reported that the asking price for Duhaime is a second-round pick. And what does Brandon Duhaime do well? He's physical. He uses a smaller frame to the max level and really has no problem throwing his weight around and being a physical player. We have seen at multiple points throughout the season, he is probably capable of being more than just a fourth-line guy. Has looked really good at different points throughout the lineup, has really underrated speed, and he is somebody that is able to help you out, at least on the penalty kill side of things, from a special teams standpoint. So has good speed, is physical, and I think is somebody who is blossoming into more than just a plug-and-play fourth-line guy. And so there would be a market, you would think, for teams looking to try to acquire his services. And if you were to get a second-round pick in this year's NHL draft, then all of a sudden you have 3. And now you're looking at the possibility to be able to move back up into the first round or just take advantage of the fact that I think scouts have said by all accounts there's something like 100 players in this draft that have graded out with a first-round grade. So the potential to do so is there. I would certainly not like to see Duhaime traded, but at the end of the day, it's not as though his skill set is irreplaceable. It's a nice skill set to have in the lineup, but it's not a skill set that you can't find elsewhere. And as we'll talk about at the end of the show today, with the fact that we haven't seen movement on the front of Marcus Foligno or Ryan Hartman potentially being traded, because we've got free agency coming up, and a lot of teams right now are in the mindset of, well, we can just find somebody like that in free agency without having to give up draft capital. So teams have been, for the most part, unless you're the Montreal Canadiens trading a first-round pick for Alex Newhook, teams by and large have been hesitant to deal their draft picks. There are a handful of teams that are always going to be super aggressive, but other teams are, it seems, more hesitant to deal those picks in favor of trying to draft players in this upcoming draft. So do I think the Wild will get a second-round pick for Brandon Duhaime? Probably not. If that opportunity presents itself, I think you have to take a serious look at it. And I think that would be something that this team would be willing to do if somebody meets that price point. So as of right now, Duhaime has not been traded, but I would say he is probably one of the more marketable assets that the Wild have to offer at the trade deadline. Certainly not the most marketable. We'll talk about him in a second in Filip Gustavsson. The other name that kind of falls into this same category is Calen Addison. And Michael Russo has reported that the asking price for Addison is a second-round pick. Now, what do we know about Addison? Very good on the offensive side of the ice, and very, very good at helping just steer play on the power play. It's not like you can just go back and look at the job that Addison did steering that top line power play when he was in the lineup compared to what that unit looked like when he was out of the lineup. It's a sizable difference, and it's no coincidence that the team's success on the power play really took a hit when Addison was out of the lineup. He does need work on the defensive side of the ice, but as I will continue to contend, his issues on the ice were not nearly as bad as some of his teammates who did not get punished for the same thing. So Addison's market being a second-round pick, I don't see teams meeting this level. Again, because of the work that Addison has to do on the defensive side of the puck. And there has been, in the last couple of weeks, there have been reports that the team was a little less inclined to move Calen Addison in a trade, opting to keep him around. But with reports now that from Joe Smith and from Michael Russo that Alex Goligoski is going to stick around, that's one spot on that third pairing that is shored up. And there's potential then that you stick with everything that you had. You put Brock Faber into that second pairing with Jonas Brodin, and you rotate Merrill and Goligoski on one side of that pairing, and you keep Calen Addison in on that third pairing. I just am of the belief that if he's going to improve on defense, as the coaching staff has suggested he needs to, he's got to play. And so if he's not going to play here, if you're going to opt instead for a Merrill Goligoski pairing, then what are you telling him about his future here? So I don't know if I don't think the Wild will get a second round pick for Calen Addison. I don't think teams are going to throw those out there for a player like Addison, who's very good offensively, but needs work on the defensive side. And so while these asking prices are out here, I don't see teams, unless there's some sort of unless the Connor Hellebuck trade happens and that just kind of reestablishes the trade market, or unless a team gets desperate to try to make a move pre-free agency, I don't see those prices being met for the Minnesota Wild. So ultimately, I think that we'll see both of those guys stick with the team through the draft, and then maybe their status gets resolved during free agency. But second round pick for both of those guys is the current asking price. Now, with that in mind, what sort of asking price, what sort of market do the Wild have with Filip Gustavsson? We'll talk about that and the merits of trading a guy coming off of the season that Gustavsson had. All that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Take your first swing at betting on the Major League Baseball season at FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Bet just $20, you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from money lines to over-unders to who you think probably Shohei Ohtani is going to hit the first home run. All in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Must be 21 plus and present in select states. First online real wager only. $10 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire 14 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under a new agreement with Kansas Star Casino LLC. Gambling problems? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit FanDuel.com/RG in Colorado, Iowa, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Tennessee, and Virginia. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT STEP to 53342 in Arizona, 1-800-888-789-777, or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut, 1-800-9 with it in Indiana, 1-800-522-4700, or visit ksgamblinghelp.com in Kansas, 1-877-770-STOP in Louisiana. Visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Visit 1800gambler.net in West Virginia, or call 1-800-522-4700 in Wyoming. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts, or call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY in New York. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, make sure you stick with us tonight for live coverage during the NHL Draft. We'll have a reaction to whoever the Wild do select, whether it be one pick, whether it be two picks. Whoever they select in the first round, we'll have live reaction to that coming up for you here tonight. So, having established that the Wild are looking for a second-round pick for Brandon Duhaime and Calen Addison, if the Wild were to view negotiations with Filip Gustavsson as he's asking too much, we're not going to be able to match that, what would the asking price be for his services? Now, we're going down this road despite the fact that Joe Smith reported that Bill Guerin has had productive talks with Gustafsson's agent while in Nashville ahead of the NHL Draft. So that is certainly positive news on that front. We all know how things went down with Cam Talbot and his agent and Bill Guerin at last year's draft, is that Talbot's camp was not happy with being in a 50-50 split and being the lesser paid goalie of the two. And so then Guerin said, I don't have to trade you. If you don't want to be here, that's just tough. You're going to have to be. And then all of a sudden, he's gone. And Filip Gustavsson comes in, has one of the best statistical seasons that this Wild franchise has seen, and was a top 2 statistical goalie in the entire NHL. But he did not get really any love in the Vezina voting, which I think paints an interesting picture. Is that nationally, I don't think a lot of writers, media members, I don't think a lot of people nationally think that this is, this is just who Filip Gustavsson is now. I think people view this as a good season for Gustavsson, playing in front of a pretty solid D-core. But odds would be then that he's not going to replicate it. And with Jesper Wallstedt in the farm system, expected to be the guy in the next year or two, are you really going to pay Filip Gustavsson and have him around when your goalie of the future is already in the farm system and probably at the latest will be on the team next year? Signs, if we're shaking the 8 ball, signs point to no. I would love to see it. I would love to have that luxury of having two guys like that can get you through. Because what have we seen in the postseason over the last couple of seasons is that it has taken a lot of teams, unless you get incredibly lucky injury-wise, it's taken teams multiple goalies to get to where they're at. But we have also seen that if you have the right structure in front, as in the Vegas Golden Knights, that you can turn Adin Hill from a guy who kind of bounced around into a Stanley Cup winning goalie. So while it is nice to have two upper-level guys, as long as you have a solid structure in front, you can find somebody and put into that spot. And if you're the Wild, going off of the season that Gustavsson just had, with the assumption that there is going to be a little bit of a fall, a little bit of regression, most likely, it again comes down to trying to maximize value. And so if you're asking for a second for Brandon Duhaime and Calen Addison, number one, just starting out, you would have to be asking for a first-round pick for Filip Gustavsson. That would have to be the starting point, and I think there's more to it than that for what he brought, what he did. He was the whole season, with the exception of the 2-game blip at the beginning of the year, he was one of the best goalies in the NHL. And so there's a price to pay for that type of production if the Wild choose to go that route. And so, again, here, I think all of this hinges on what happens with Connor Hellebuyck. And there's not going to be any sort of movement on that front until Hellebuyck is moved. And so it could be that it happens. It could be that things happen very quickly, or the Wild see what was acquired for Hellebuyck's services and opt, that's not enough for what we're looking for. But again, I think the Wild would prefer to keep Filip Gustavsson around, but at the same time, if his price is too high for the Wild to meet, then you have to look at other options. And again, it's not as though your cupboard is bare in the minors to where you're really going to feel the loss of a guy like Gustavsson because you don't have a backup plan. The Wild have their backup plan. They have their plan A in Iowa right now. So that is another factor to consider with however these negotiations end up going with Gustavsson. And again, I'll reiterate, as I said on yesterday's show, just be nice to have something happen because there just has been. It's like you're fishing, except instead of casting the lines out, you take one, you put the bobber on, you throw that thing out as far as you can, and you're just kicking back until a fish grabs it. Now, you will see some bites here and there that grab your attention, but again, unless a fish grabs that hook, you are not doing a thing different. So it will be interesting to see which route the Wild decide to go. because Gustavsson also wants to return. He wants to be in Minnesota. And so you have also the mentality of what's the holdup. So I think if there are trade discussions with Gustavsson, it's got to involve at least a first round pick, and I would imagine it would take probably a prospect at least. Not a huge trade machine guy. So I would imagine a first and a prospect at the least if you are going to trade Filip Gustavsson. Now, what's left in the cupboard? Why have we not heard more steam on guys like Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman, Marco Rossi? Well, we'll discuss as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, make sure to tune in for our NHL Draft coverage tonight. We will have special videos breaking down each of the Wild's first-round picks, and then, of course, we'll react to the entire draft as well. So make sure to follow along for that. Subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any of our content throughout the course of the week. So the other assets that the Wild could look to deal this during the draft, Marco Rossi is certainly one of them, although I think there has been more traction on the front of let's see what he's got as opposed to abandoning the plan, giving up on the plan, and dealing him to try to move up in the draft. I think it's more likely, and I would actually prefer to give Rossi an opportunity and see what we have before electing to move on from him. It's very possible that he has kind of gotten that taste and improved his game down in Iowa to add a little bit more on the defensive side and the physicality side. It's possible that he plays at the NHL level and just hits the ground running and never looks back. It's also possible that he just still struggles to kind of find what is needed to get it done at the NHL level. But again, this team is in the position right now with limited funds, limited ability to improve this roster. This is where the young kids come in. We've talked about this ad nauseum through the offseason. This is now the time in which this team needs to start injecting some youth into this lineup to see what they have so that they know what they need once the Parise and Suter cap hits drop to just the buyouts. You have to know what you need. And so you need to know what you have. And so it would seem foolish to me to, after 20 games in the NHL, to move on from Marco Rossi unless some team unless you get some team that is just so enamored with what he's able to do that they throw you a first-round pick. I don't do it unless there's an overpay. And an overpay for me, I think, would be something like what the Canadians gave up for Alex Newhook. If a team comes knocking to the Minnesota Wild and offers a first-round pick, something other than, the bottom 4 picks, in that case, then yeah, I'm probably willing to listen. But beyond that, I would much rather just give an opportunity to see what we've got. On the veteran side of things, it has been interesting. There has been really no chatter in the Marcus Foligno trade route. And there really hasn't been any in the Ryan Hartman route either. Because let's keep this in mind. Talked about this when talking about Brandon Duhaime and Calen Addison. We still have yet to get to free agency. And so I think teams are hesitant to make moves for depth guys. We've seen moves to acquire top-end guys, but teams are hesitant to acquire, unless you're Chicago and you're trading for Nick Foligno as part of the Taylor Hall trade. and Boston in a situation in which they have to absolutely unload salary cap money to be able to do anything. And they're still in real bad shape. I think ultimately the route that we'll see with Foligno and Hartman is if they start the season off playing well and this team struggles, as I think we would expect that they will, if they play well, but the team is struggling, the route for these guys to go is to be traded at the deadline, because that's kind of where they're at right now. And I know Hartman plays higher up in the lineup, plays as the 1C, but in reality, if you're talking about a playoff team, if you're talking about the Tampa Bay Lightning during their peak, during their multiple runs to the Cup final, if you're putting Marcus Foligno or Ryan Hartman in that lineup, maybe third line, but definitely bottom six. And so the market for those kind of guys, especially ahead of free agency, is not good. And they're coming off of seasons in which they struggled through large parts of the year. Foligno just looked completely like a shell of what he did the previous year. And for Hartman, ton of penalties, his production cut in half. So for those guys to be moved, it's going to be during the season after they've had good stretches in which it's okay. Now we can say last year was a bit of a blip between the last 3 seasons. And if they struggle again this upcoming season, then they're probably just going to walk. But that's just the state of the market right now. And so for those that are wanting to see action on that front, I think at this point it makes more sense to hope for good stretches and for this team to fall out of contention, to deal them, and then to open up some roster spots for younger players to finish out the rest of the season. That's I think because this roster is going to be limited again going into the season. And it's not impossible for them to make the playoffs, but I think we all know, based off of how they're currently constructed, that it would be a tall order to try to go anywhere in the postseason with this roster just running it back. So that's kind of where things are at, where my head is at heading into the draft tonight. And so we'll see. We'll see how aggressively Bill Guerin plays this. We'll see if we get some answers on any of the questions that are still yet to be answered for this franchise heading into free agency this weekend. So a lot still on the plate that needs to be resolved. Hopefully we get a little closer to some of those answers here this evening. But that will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Again, thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time tuning into Locked On Wild, we thank you for choosing Locked On Wild today and hope you stick with us through the rest of the offseason. If you're one of the everydayers who tunes in, Brian, Denny, Ron, Travis, any of those guys that tune in every single day of the week, we thank you for being part of the Locked On Wild community, and we hope to see you on tomorrow's episode. You can find new content every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.